Hello and welcome to Empire of Wargames. My name is Senpai and today we are talking about the Orks Combat Patrol box. If you're interested in price, savings, points, upgrades and more, you've come to the right place. And if you enjoy the content, consider leaving a thumbs up and subscribing, as well as checking the links down in the description below if you want to support what I do. As always, all the interesting links and pointers are going to be down in the pinned comment below, like for example my Combat Patrol Alternatives video for Orks in specific. So if you're interested in other 500 points lists, other ways to start your Ork army, that is the video for you. But keep in mind that that video is not made with Nephilim in mind, so it is a little bit older, but you can still kind of extrapolate all the relevant information to start your Ork army in a different way than just buying the Combat Patrol box. Now when we talk about this or Combat Patrol box, there's a lot to consider and a lot to talk about. So why don't we start with the basics? You're getting 25 miniatures for your money, which is 90 pounds a local equivalent, and you're getting 20 Ork boys, a warboss in mega armor, 3 death copters and a death dread. That is the baseline. What is important to note here is that there are 2 kits of Ork boys available currently. There's one newer kit that is all monopose and barely lets you choose anything other than the heavy weapon and maybe the knob. And then there is the old Ork boys kit that GW decided to just keep around, and that is a great thing. And that one has a ton of options, but the models look a little bit more dated there. So if you're looking for the Ork boys kit with all the options, it is not this one in this Combat Patrol box. You are getting 2 entire kits or 2 boxes of the newer Ork boys that are fixed, and the loadout for them is 5 regular boys with melee weapons, 1 knob, 1 boy with heavy weapon, and 3 boys with shooters. And that is fixed unless you want to take your X-Acto knife and cut limbs apart and reattach them in some weird way and do kind of that kind of modding and kit bashing to your miniatures. But if you build them as they're intended, that is the fixed loadout you have to go with. So there's been a lot of controversy about that in the past year. So yeah, just take a look at the sprues. All of them are over at the GW web store. Take a look at the models and decide for yourself whether these are the Orks you want to go with, whether you want to just kit bash them slightly to make them look a little bit different, or if that doesn't bother you at all and you just want to have the newer Ork boys because they look a little bit nicer maybe or whatever. So but that is something that is definitely important to keep in mind when buying this box. But before we go into more detail, how about we talk about all the units in specific separately. The first choice here is our HQ choice, and it is the Warboss in Mega Armor. This one is a new model. It looks great. It is quite a hefty model. It sits on a 50mm base. It is a melee powerhouse and is quite durable to boot depending on which relics and warlord traits you decide to pick with this one. It's a great little model. It costs 24 pounds separately, so it's not exactly cheap either. And yeah, it's just a solid inclusion. Having a Warboss as a baseline for any starting army is great. Although I would say that having the Warboss is also a little bit of diminishing returns as soon as you try to buy this box 2 or even 3 times, because you can only run 1 Warboss per detachment. So yeah, that is important to keep in mind. But all in all, I personally like this model. I'd had a lot of success running it for Crusade campaigns or in Crusade campaigns, and also in some semi-competitive matches. But I think at the very top end, it doesn't quite hold up. Next up are the Ork boys, and you're getting 20 of them. As I said, it is a fixed loadout of 5 melee boys, basically 3 shooters, 1 Ork boy with heavy weapon, and 1 knob per 10. And there's really nothing you can do about that. You can build one of the boys with heavy weapon with a big shooter or with a rocket launcher, and that is basically it. And you have some minor cosmetic options for your knobs, and that is it. But the new Orks look great. There's no denying that. Monopose means that the poses themselves are more dynamic, although you cannot alter them at all. Yeah, just something to consider. Keep that in mind. Ork boys are currently okay. They are nothing to write home about. Beastnagger boys are still the cream of the crop when it comes to troops, but I think they're absolutely solid ever since they got a little bit cheaper. And yeah, just a solid unit to include. Definitely nothing you'll regret having. Next up are the 3 death copters in our fast attack slot, and the death copters are really good units. I've rated them very highly back in the day when they weren't seeing so much competitive play, and now I think they are just amazing. They are good in melee, they are good at range, They are good against bigger targets like vehicles and so on, and they are decent against your chaff units or infantry. I think they are just an all-around great unit. They are a little bit expensive at 150 points base, but I think they are well worth the price. If you know how to use them, if you take your time and assess the targets for them and pilot them correctly, you're easily going to get that experience when playing Orks and when playing this combat patrol box in specific. And yeah, it's just a great unit all around, and I highly recommend getting it even multiple times later on. And last but not least, in a heavy support slot, is the Death Dread. The Death Dread is the oldest model in this box, and I think the only model that released prior to 2021. And I think it's an absolutely solid model with a lot of loadout options, like for example 4 Scorchers or 4 melee weapons or rocket launchers, custom mega blasters. You have a ton of options to build this guy, and you can run 3 of them in a unit, which means that having more of them is definitely not a bad thing to have. I think the Death Dread is a solid kind of mid-tier unit in the Orc Codex and will definitely see play, especially in Crusade campaigns. And I think it is not as annoying as, say, its Space Marine pendant, the Dreadnought, in 500 points games, simply because Orc tech and Orc vehicles and Dreadnoughts and those kind of units tend to be a little bit squishier than all of the other counterparts, and that makes them way more playable, way easier to counter for your opponent, especially in a casual and more fun-orientated environment and less competitive, and thus it is just a great inclusion in this box, and I don't mind it at all. So all in all, the army composition looks very, very good. I'm a big fan of the Death Copters, I'm a big fan of the Death Dread. The Orc Boys are really the only point of contention here. I think the Orc Boys and Mega Armor looks awesome, and having at least one of them is not a bad deal at all. So yeah, all you need to consider is whether you want those 20 new Orc Boys or whether you want to stick with the old ones, or if you don't mind mixing them. Next up, we are going to talk about the savings and the price. Now, when we look at the price, it is cost just as much as any other Combat Patrol box at £90, a local equivalent. It is one of the slightly more expensive boxes over in Australia, where it costs 230 Australian. Now, that doesn't take away from the savings at all. We are talking about 39 to 42% of savings. And that is achievable due to a lot of the models being monopose or not having any additional bits or posing options or decorative options. So that is something you need to keep in mind. While this box and the savings are incredible, you don't have a lot of options outside of, using your Exacto knife or using or just slapping bits onto them, which always works. But generally speaking, the savings are insane, but you're letting go or you're missing a lot of the options the regular Orc Boys would have had, and so on. Next up, we are going to talk about the points and power level. So when we look at the base list, if you just include them, how they are depicted on the box, you're probably going to sit right around 530 points. As you can see, I extended or expanded the drop-down menu for the Orc Boys, so you have the exact loadout you will get when assembling them. As I said, Boss Knob, heavy weapon, 3 shooters, 5 boys with slugger and chopper, that's it. Other than that, 530 points is absolutely solid as a baseline minimum, but what we usually look at and what is usually determining whether the points of a box are good is the maximum. I am not going to include a specific list for the minimum points, because really the only thing you can do is take a big shooter instead of the rocket launcher for both your squads, which is going to kind of subtract 10 points in total. So the minimum for this specific box or list is 520 points. Meanwhile, the maximum is at 590 points, which I consider to be right around the average point. It is nothing to write home about, and the box got a little bit cheaper ever since the Orc Boys got cheaper as well. So it used to be more expensive when it comes to points, but that has since turned out for the better, at least for the regular Orc Boys. I think 590 points is not bad at all. That is not quite a negative, I would say, but yeah, as I said, it is nothing to write home about. 590 points is decent. Now, if you are new to Warhammer 40,000, or if you're just asking yourself, hey, I have bought this box, how should I kind of build my 500 points list, or how should I play this list? Here's an example of how I played this list, and you can make changes according to what you see fit. But I personally run it like this. You basically are lacking the points to run 2 Orc Boy squads, simply because, yeah, you're going to run out of points. So I just cut one of the squads away, used all of the Orc Boys and added it to the existing squad, and just filled it up to 498 points. And other than that, I left the Death Dread as it is. I just added a Scorcher. All of the rest is just full melee. And the Death Copters have a big bomb attached to them, and that is basically it. It is a very simple list. You are only running one troops choice, but that is kind of the bane of this specific box. Just out of points for 2 troops choices. And yeah, it's a solid list. It works fine. It's fun to play, and it's definitely a decent start for a 500 points list to play against friends. Now, if you're asking yourself how this box plays out of the box, it is very simple. You are sending your Orc Warboss with Mega Armor together with your Orc Boys to the front. The Death Dread is going to take another flank all on its own, and you're hopefully either going to survive with it, or it's going to just blow to pieces depending on the firepower and how your opponent is going to allocate their firepower. And your Death Copters are your fast moving unit that is going to try and help out anywhere on the board. As I said, Death Copters are quite pricey and they are not super durable, so you need to be sure what you're going to do with them, because even though they are good in melee and at range, you still need to be very careful because, yeah, as I said, they're just a little bit squishy and they tend to blow up really, really quickly. And a lot of opponents, and I'm speaking from experience here, tend to target them over the Death Dread. So just to keep that in mind. Next up is the FAQ section of the video, and the first question is, how should you paint your models, or which Orc culture should you go with? And the competitive choice currently, at least as far as I know, are Goths. Goths are very simple. They are just black with some checkerboard patterns. But as always, I'm going to just recommend that you paint them however you want and just declare them being one culture or another or whatever you want. If you want to go with the competitive choice, it is going to be Goths. But as I said, even in GW official tournaments, if you paint them purple, green, and red, and you say that they are Goths, you're going to be fine. As soon as you paint them a certain way and apply transfer sheets and so on, they are then locked in a certain faction and you're going to have to stick with it, at least in official tournaments. In casual, no one cares. Next up is the question, is this box good for competitive? And I would say no. Almost no combat patrol is, unless almost all of the units, and I'm speaking like 5 out of kind of 6 units in a box, for example, are competitive choices. I'm not going to recommend it. Buy your stuff separately, look at what's good in the meta, or try your own experiments and evaluate all the units on your own and try new lists and try to be an innovator and go from there. It is really that simple. The next changes for competitive and for match play are going to release right around January. So if you're planning to start an orc army for a competitive environment, I would suggest waiting until January, then building your list as soon as all those new patches and nerfs and buffs have been applied. And yeah, just go from there. All you need to really be as a competitive player is creative, try to be an innovator, and be a fast painter. And that is really it. Next up is the question, is this box good for Crusade? And I would say it is decent. There are a lot of ways you could play and build this list for Crusade. Here's an example list where we are sitting at right around 25 power level, which is the base starting point for any Crusade army. And all you need to really decide is whether you want to run 2 boys squads or whether you want to run a 24 power level list and remove the Death Dread, basically. What I've done here is obviously remove 1 squad of boys, and that brings us to 25 power level. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Death Copter's Big Bomb, for example, or the Death Dread weapons or any upgrades for them do not cost any power level. So you can go crazy there, you can go with whatever you find cool or whatever is effective, depending on how you play Crusade. And last but not least, is this box good for narrative? And I would say that for narrative, a box needs to have a cohesive theme, and this box is a little bit too generic and too all over the place for that. Having boys is always useful, having a Death Dread is cool, having Death Copters is cool, and having a Orc Boss and Mega Armor is cool, but it doesn't have a cohesive theme, like for example, a list that is all Speed Freaks and a Death Trike and War Bikers and all of that stuff. So if you are going to go for a specific theme of orcs, if you want to go for pirate orcs, if you want to go for speed freaks or mechanized with killer cans and a lot of death dreads, buy your stuff separately. I think you are going to nail the theme that way better. This box is for a generic starting army for new players who just want to assemble their units and models, play a little bit and expand from there. Next up, we are going to talk about upgrades, and the first upgrade we always talk about is whether this box is worth it to be picked up multiple times. And if you buy it twice, this is what a list could look like. Obviously, you can only run one war boss per detachment, so there's only one here. You're sitting at right around 995 points, so it is definitely playable at 1000 points. Is it a good list? I think it's fine. You're running a lot of boys, you're running a lot of dev copters and 2 dev dreads. It is not the hardest hitting list of all time. You're missing a lot of anti-vehicle firepower, but you have a lot of boys, and the war boss can destroy vehicles, and so can the dev copters and the dev dread as well if he gets there. But all in all, the one thing you need to consider is whether you have a way to either sell the war boss and mega armor, kit bash them into something else, or whatever you want to do with it. But I think the savings of this box are so high that even if you just put the war boss aside and don't do anything with it, you're still going to be fine. As soon as you buy it 3 times though, you're then going to start having diminishing returns. Having 3 dev dreads is great. Having 3 squads of dev copters is nothing I would complain about personally, but you're then quickly going to run out of fast attack slots because you cannot stack more dev copters than 3 per unit. That's just a fixed number. So those are all the things you need to consider. I think buying it twice is fine. 3 times is a little bit iffy. Next up are some separate recommendations. First up are recommendations for a more competitive army. Currently, and this always changes, as I said, new changes are going to occur in January, but as of recording this video, kill rigs are incredibly effective. They are back to their original points cost. You can see in the codex as well. Competitive players are running 3 of them. Commandos are incredibly effective infantry. People are usually running 2 or 3 boxes of them. When it comes to your regular troops, Beastnagger boys seem to be taking the crown over regular boys simply because of their invulnerable save, and they barely cost more than regular Ork boys, and it just makes them that much more effective. And yeah, those are my recommendations for a slightly more competitive or semi-competitive approach. My personal recommendations of what I personally find cool are adding more dev dreads, dev copters, and killer cans. I personally like a more mechanized force, but not exactly the speed freaks variety, but more of a kind of dread variety and just, your walker variety. I personally find them all very, very cool, and it would certainly make for a cool thematic army. Other units that would be great centerpiece models would be, for example, Gasgul Thraka, or all of the other vehicles that are on those bigger bases, like, for example, the Boomdaka Snares Wagon. So you have a lot of options for the Orks, no matter if you want to go for a Crusade approach, for competitive, or for kind of a Speed Freaks, or whatever you personally find cool approach, you're certainly going to find something within the Ork roster. And now we are at the ratings and conclusion part of this video. I would personally give this box a 7 out of 10. I think it is above average. I think it offers a great starting point for new players, with the biggest caveats being the Ork Boys kit, and that one being highly controversial, and either you love it or you hate it. There's usually no in between. It lacks a little bit of cohesion. It is all over the place, which can be either seen as a plus point because it adds variety, or it can be seen as a detriment for, not being that interesting for narrative, for example. And the points are average at best. So yeah, I think a 7 out of 10 rating is fair. If I were to change anything about this box, I would personally probably remove one of the Ork Boy squads and replace them with something else, like, for example, Looters or the older Ork Boys. So you have a lot of bits to add and modify your current starting force. Especially the old Ork Boys kits have a lot of bits, so you can just alter all your models, kit bash a little bit, especially the newer Ork Boys, and make everything look a little bit more cohesive or fitting to whatever your fantasy of Orks is. But other than that, yeah, I think 7 out of 10 is definitely decent. And if you have anything to add in the comments, like, for example, recommendations on how to upgrade it, if you've played this box yourself and have kind of any experiences to share, or if you have anything else to add down in the comments below, I would love to read and hear about it. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.